west coast of Africa, looking today much as it did 100 years ago. At that time, the old evils of the slave trade had become a distant, though disgraceful, memory. But there now opened a new chapter of confrontation along these tropical shores. In past years, Europeans had come here for profitable business. Now they wanted more, much more. Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the Black Continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufacturers, and new positions of advantage against its rivals. This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a Congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? The helpless children, meanwhile, sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun. The European invasions were widely resisted. Conquest was never easy. And sometimes, as these old drawings and photographs testify, conquest led to a ruthless killing that later generations would prefer to forget. Resistance took many shapes. In French West Africa, a focal point was found in Muslim loyalties. Many heroes, still unforgotten, came on that scene. Some, like the Senegalese religious leader Ahmadou Bamba, offered the way of peace, but were still sent into exile. Others, like the fierce warrior leader Samori, fought off French attack after attack and was crushed and exiled only after years of war. Death took many, strong or weak. With the skulls of earlier wars displayed in their capital, Kumasi, the powerful Ashanti nation ruled over most of modern Ghana. Led by their kings, who had the title of Asantehene, they'd long defended their country against Britain. But now they desperately wanted a peaceful settlement. In 1895, fearing a disastrous war with Britain, King Prempeh made a strong bid for peace from his palace here at Kumasi. He offered the British the right to establish in Ashanti a chartered company with all the concessions, the privilege that such a company could possibly desire. But it wasn't enough, for the British now wanted territorial possession as well as privilege. The Ashanti nation had already fought long, hard battles against the British. But this time, in 1896, they decided to surrender. In a ceremony of deliberate humiliation, the king was made to kiss the British commander's boot and then sent into exile. But it wasn't the end of the story. The British now blundered. A new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, decided that he had to get possession of the sacred golden stool, symbol of the Ashanti nation's soul. Arriving at the British fort here in Kumasi, he ordered the assembled chiefs to hand the stool over. Worse still, he demanded the right to sit on it, something that no person had ever been allowed to do, not even the king himself. To Hodgson's final insult, the Ashanti replied with war. This little fort at Kumasi is what the British had built, just in case, and now they sorely needed it. The few dozen British inmates of the fort were besieged for months and had to eat rats to stay alive. Hodgson's act of folly had exacted a bitter price. Efforts to send in relief from the coast were repeatedly frustrated by Ashanti resistance, until finally the governor and his wife got away to the coast and the absurd but tragic affair could be closed. This ended war between Britain and Ashanti, and a year later, in 1901, the British quietly annexed the country, which became part of the colony of the Gold Coast. All over Africa, the new military technology of automatic guns gave easy victories to the invaders. Countless resistors died. Many thousands at the single battle of Omdurman in Britain's conquest of the Sudan. Meanwhile, in another part of the Sudan, the French were also scoring victories. For the most part, public opinion rejoiced. For were these not victories over an inferior species, a kind of joke humanity? There were some critics, but not many, and their voice was ignored or silenced. What really mattered was to do down one's European rivals. If you were British, to get the better of the French in West Africa or of the Germans in East Africa. While orphans like little Uganda were left on the protective doorstep of Father John Bull. Even before 1900, there came a new source of conflict: settlers from Europe. French in the far north, Dutch and then British in the far south, and some Germans. Other settlers were attracted to the good farming land of the east, to Tanganyika, northern and southern Rhodesia, and the British territories of Uganda and Kenya. Once again, nobody asked permission. An early French governor had laid down the golden rule. Wherever good water and fertile land are found, he said, settlers must be installed without questioning whose land it may be. The settlers, not surprisingly, agreed. The next step in East Africa was to build a railway from the coast to the interior. The line was completed in 1901, and millions of acres of good farming land in Kenya were opened to white ownership and settlement for the buying price of next to nothing. These white strangers, oddly enough, were at first welcomed by the African inhabitants. But the welcome didn't last for long, for they soon discovered that colonial government wanted them to give things, above all their land and their labor. These colonial demands provoked a repeated resistance, and against that resistance, the colonial government, with white settlers arriving in ever larger numbers from Britain, waged a war with little mercy, and of course with rifles and machine guns against spears and arrows.
Macinire nĩ ũndũ wa kũmena andũ ũndũ gũtikĩrĩ ũndũ mekagwo nĩ kũmakia andũ ũguo magagĩũka magagĩtorekia na andũ morarĩ magacina mĩciĩ. This beating down of a sometimes violent and desperate African protest was called pacification, or less politely, hammering. A British officer then fighting in Kenya kept a sadly instructive diary.
Marched into Fort Hall, and the expedition comes to an end. To my mind, the people of the Embu have not been sufficiently hammered, and I should like to go back at once and have another go at them. During the first phase of our expedition against the Irieni, we killed 797 niggers, and during the second phase against the Embu, we killed about 250.
There was, in fact, much more of the same thing. In a sixth campaign against the Kenya Nandi, for example, British troops reported killing 1,117 people, besides seizing all their livestock. In 1906, a junior British minister in London cabled this protest: "Surely it cannot be necessary to go on killing these defenseless people on such an enormous scale." The minister's name was Winston Churchill, but on that occasion his intervention had no effect.
Nĩtuonire kũrĩ ũtiganu ũndũ nĩmokire gũtunya andũ ithaka, andũ makoragĩra kwa mĩceni nĩyo yarĩ na tha. Andũ magathiĩ kwa mĩceni, mũndũ akagahata haha, magoka magakata haha, thome ha mũndũ ũcio